Continuing with our exploration of deep order, today I'd like to contemplate the nature of change and particularly frame change. So, over the last few weeks, we have arrived at a developmental model within deep order, and this developmental model arises from a point or region of space and then goes through in time a particular development through three phases. And as the development in this final phase proceeds, in the mental or flower phase, more of an aspect of the fullness that underlay this entire possibility comes to the surface. Now, in the last few weeks, what we did was we deconstructed this model of development so that, in effect, we arrived at different types of leadership, organization, and personality. And just to quickly summarize, we looked at a physical type, a vital type, a mental type, an integrative type, a type of force, a contextual type, and a macro type. And these were instances of types of leadership all derived from this model of development that emerges in deep order. And then what we did is we looked at different types of organizations and saw that there was more or less a one-to-one mapping between these 7 types and 7 types of organizations. And then we looked at personality types and saw that there was also a mapping, and we arrived at 13 types of personality types based on these 7 deconstructed leadership styles, if you will. So when we consider any wedge of causality, so any region bound by time and space, the question is, within a certain boundary of time and a boundary of space, as things happen, and now we see that a lot of different dynamics are occurring because just by the very nature of having so many different types of leadership and personalities and organization types, dynamics can occur that shift reality very often or move reality in many different directions, and as a result, change is experienced constantly. So the question is, how do we frame that kind of change? So if we expand out this region here, so we have that region bound by a certain time and a certain space, and we ask ourselves, how do we frame change? Then certainly one way to frame change is to look at the different kinds of operating realities that could exist within that bounded area. So as already mentioned, we have a physical type, vital, mental, integrative, operational reality based on a deeper force. And then there's the 2 more advanced operating realities. And in fact, these kinds of operating realities, as I'll just speak to in a moment, perhaps don't count as change, but let's define change as being a shift or a dislocation rather in operating reality. So we have these different operating realities, and we're saying that change can be framed as a dislocation in operating reality. So certainly the first 5 types, we can see that there would be a dislocation, but when we talk about operating reality at the contextual or macro level, where we have a much higher degree of consciousness on the part of leaders or organizations or personalities, change would be experienced more harmoniously as opposed to as a dislocation, and therefore we won't consider that in our framing of change at the moment. Now the question is, having defined change as a dislocation in operating reality, how would we define the magnitude of change? So that's what we're going to look at now. So the magnitude of change There are I would say, I propose that there are two ways, fundamental ways in which magnitude can be computed. So one is if we consider the movement from higher operating reality to lower operating reality, and then if we consider the movement from a lower operating reality to a higher operating reality. So let's look at the movement from the higher to the lower first. And as I said, I'm not going to count these two because there's more harmony at those levels. But assume you have an environment or some operations or an operating reality that's functioning at this level where there's an aspect of force that really drives things. And now, for some reason, that operating reality has to downshift to an integrative type, so that's already 1 degree of dislocation, or it has to downgrade to a mental type, so that's a 2nd degree of dislocation, or to a vital type, so that's a 3rd degree of dislocation, or to the physical type, and that's a 4th degree of dislocation. And there are many reasons why this could happen, but one common reason, for instance, is that you have an organization that is driven by a certain kind of a leader, and then that leader departs, and you have a new leader comes in who sees things very, very differently, and suddenly your operating environment might downshift 4 levels or degrees of magnitude, and that's a huge change in terms of the actual dislocation that's being experienced by people in that environment. Now, if we consider the other direction, so the upshifting, so assume you have an organization operating at the physical level, and they have to upshift to a vital level, that's 1 degree of dislocation, or they have to now shift to the mental level, that's a 2nd degree of dislocation, or this operating reality has to shift now to this integrative type. Again, I wouldn't count this as a dislocation because this already implies greater harmony. So when we talk about upshift, there's 2 degrees of dislocation that are possible. And this is as opposed to 4 degrees of dislocation when we talk about downshift. And this kind of situation where we move from physical to vital is very common today. For example, in the healthcare space, hospitals all over the United States and soon to be, I'm sure, all over the world are moving from a reality of status quo to really examining how their processes are working and the amount of waste in those processes. So there's a much more vital orientation where the energy in processes is being reconfigured, and that's a degree of dislocation that's being experienced, and we already know that the impact of that 1 degree of dislocation can be huge. So when we think about the magnitude of change, what I would propose is that if we map degrees of dislocation on one axis, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees of dislocation possible, and we map the amount of change that's actually happening. At the very least, this is a linear function, so that what we're saying is that if there's 1 degree of dislocation, there's a certain amount of change, x. If there is 2 degrees of dislocation, there's x plus y. 3 degrees of dislocation, it's x plus y plus z in terms of change. 4 degrees of dislocation, it's x plus y plus z plus w, so a much higher degree of change. And so, just summarizing, when we frame change, we can think of change as a dislocation operating reality, and then more concretely, looking at the different kinds of operating realities and looking in particular at the 5 types of operating realities where dislocation does occur. And then we can put some kind of magnitude around that change, and that magnitude can be, in this kind of framing, a maximum of 4 degrees of dislocation. Now, this is change from the outside in, and the next time what I'll do is I'll look at change from the inside out.